Unitarian Universalist Church of Worcester podcast. We are a community built on love, hope, and justice. Our goal is to inspire people to take on the challenges of a changing world. Each week we'll bring you a reflection from our minister, the Reverend Aaron Payson, recorded during our Sunday service. Maybe it'll move you, challenge your thinking, or even stir up a little righteous indignation. That's all welcome here. Thanks for listening.
I want to share with you a modern parable, or perhaps some of you would refer to it as a fairy tale. You decide. In the days when banners snapped like thunder and soldiers marched like a single heartbeat, there ruled a man named Pmurt. P-M-U-R-T. A man who trusted the sword more than the people who lived beneath it. He believed peace was something you could enforce. He believed loyalty was something you could command. He believed safety was something you could seize from the trembling hands of neighboring lands. And so his armies grew. And so did his borders. And so his people learned to bow before they learned to speak. Power he had in abundance, but it was a power without love. And so it hollowed him from within and hardened the world around him. In a small village where Pmurt's soldiers rarely lingered, a circle of neighbors gathered at dusk. They lit a single lantern and passed it from hand to hand. They whispered prayers for courage. They sang songs of mercy. They dreamed of a kingdom where fear was not the price of survival. Their love was deep, but it was quiet. And quiet love alone could not mend a breaking world. In the capital's shadowed alleyways, another group formed, not with lanterns, but with hammers. They were tired of decrees that bruised their dignity, tired of soldiers who marched through their markets, tired of a man who mistook obedience for devotion. Their anger was fierce, but it was scattered. And scattered power alone could not heal a wounded land. Then came the summer, when three rulers rose against Pmurt's conquests. Fields burned, villagers fled, the sky itself seemed to tremble. And on a road thick with smoke and refugees, the lantern bearers and the hammer bearers met for the first time. They argued, and they accused, and they wept, and then they listened. From their listening rose a new resolve. Love must grow a spine. Power must grow a heart. Justice must bind them both. They formed a covenant, a circle of flame and stone. Tenderness braided with courage, compassion fused with resolve. They fed the hungry. They sheltered the fleeing. They confronted the king's officers, not with violence, but with an unyielding clarity. And that kingdom began to see that this covenant was not rebellion, it was responsibility. When the covenant reached the palace gates, they did not come with swords, they came with children carrying lanterns. Elders carrying petitions, farmers carrying stones, soldiers carrying regret. Permert looked down from his balcony and saw something he had never seen before, a people united not by fear, but by purpose. He saw that his armies could not rebuild trust. He saw that his decrees could not mend the land. He saw that his power, so long wielded without love, had become a burden too heavy for his people to bear. And for the first time, he felt the weight of his station and something that bent his neck instead of lifting his stature. At dawn, Permert descended the palace steps. He carried no sword, he carried no armor, he held only the seal of his office, a seal that had once defined him. And before the covenant and before the people, before the lantern's trembling light, he placed the seal upon the ground. And the people have said, "You have mistaken domination for strength. You have mistaken fear for loyalty. You have mistaken conquest for peace. This seal belongs to one who knows how to wield power with love. You are not that ruler." Then Permert fled in disgrace from the truth. The people did not cheer. They breathed. They breathed as though for the first time in years. They breathed as though the air itself had been unshackled. And in that breath, they understood. Love without power is fragile. Power without love is cruel. Together, however, they can build a community and a country where justice is the shape love takes when it refuses to look away. So they lifted their lanterns and they raised their hammers. And they began to work, rebuilding not just their community, but one another. And the dawn, they say, grew brighter that day. Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. These words by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. appear in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? Published back in 1967. Some of you remember then. I've been told if you do remember, though, you weren't there. The book argues that in 1967, the United States stood at a moral crossroads. Either descend into chaos fueled by racism, poverty, and militarism, or build a just, multiracial democracy grounded in economic justice, nonviolence, and the ideal of beloved community. Beloved community being the modern theological expression for the more archaic notion of the kingdom of God, and one that realizes the co-creative intention of faithful discipleship toward a vision of sustainable and just relations between all beings. King's oft-quoted analysis of the relationship between power and love comes in his book as almost a benediction to his description of a moment in the civil rights movement that seems eerily similar to one we face at this moment in our country. 1967, James Meredith, an American civil rights activist, writer, political advisor, and United States Air Force veteran, was shot a number of times while beginning a 220-mile solo march from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi, to highlight continuing racism in the South and to encourage voter registration after passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Interestingly, Meredith did not want major civil rights organizations to become involved in this effort at the time, which might be attributable to, in part, to what he had experienced only a few years earlier in 1962, when he became the first African-American student admitted to the racially segregated University of Mississippi after the intervention of the federal government, an event that was a flashpoint in the civil rights movement. Inspired by John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, Meredith decided to exercise his constitutional rights and apply to the University of Mississippi. His goal was to put pressure on the Kennedy administration to enforce the civil rights for African Americans. The admission of Meredith ignited the Old Miss riot of 1962, where Meredith's life was threatened and 31,000 American service people were required to quell the violence, the largest ever invocation of the Insurrection Act of 1807. Makes you wonder about the Insurrection Act and how it is being talked about today. King writes of the response by himself and other civil rights leaders at the time to go to Memphis and to visit James Meredith in the hospital, and together with his blessing, continue the march he had begun only a few days earlier on his own. What follows for King is a poignant reflection on the fragile nature of movement building at a moment when often desperate proclivities toward the reality of violence competed for allegiance. He writes, in a brief conference, Floyd, Stokely, and I agreed that the march would be jointly sponsored by CORE, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, with the understanding that all other civil rights organizations would be invited to join. It was also agreed that we would issue a national call for support and participation. I think of this as colleagues of mine are now flying to Minneapolis. 1 hour later, after making staff assignments, he writes, and setting up headquarters at the Reverend James Lawson's church in Memphis, a group of us packed into 4 automobiles and made our way to the desolate spot on Highway 51 where James Meredith had been shot the day before. And so began the second stage of the Meredith, Mississippi Freedom March. As we walked, he writes, down the meandering highway in the sweltering heat, there was much talk and many questions were raised. I'm not for that nonviolent stuff anymore, shouted one of the younger activists. If one of these damn white Mississippi crackers touches me, I'm going to knock the hell out of them, shouted another. Later on, a discussion of the composition of the march came up. This should be an all-black march, said one marcher. We don't need any more white phonies and liberals invading our movement. This is our march. Once during the afternoon, he writes, we stopped to sing We Shall Overcome. The voices rang out with all the traditional fervor, the glad thunder and gentle strength that had always characterized the singing of this noble song. But when we came to the stanza which speaks of black and white together, the voices of a few marchers were muted. I asked them later why they refused to sing that verse. The retort was, this is a new day. We don't sing those words anymore. In fact, the whole song should be discarded. Not we shall overcome, but we shall overrun. King says, as I listened to all these comments, the words fell on my ears like strange music from a foreign land. My hearing was not attuned to the sound of such bitterness. I guess I should not have been surprised. I should have known that in an atmosphere where false promises are daily realities, where deferred dreams are nightly facts, where acts of unpunished violence toward blacks are a way of life. Nonviolence would eventually be seriously questioned. I should have been reminded that disappointment produces despair, and despair produces bitterness, and that the one thing certain about bitterness is its blindness. Bitterness has not the capacity to make the distinction between some and all. When some members of a dominant group, particularly those in power, are racist in attitude and practice, bitterness accuses the whole group. What King then describes is the challenge of listening and striving both to understand each other and to figure out a way to maintain the integrity of the movement and the safety of its participants. The primary concerns were around whether the effort moving forward should be black only or at least thoroughly de-emphasize white participation. King responded, and I love this, like life, racial understanding is not something that we find, but something that we must create. What we find when we enter these mortal planes is existence, but existence is the raw material out of which all life must be created. A productive and happy life is not something that you find. It is something that you make. And so the ability of blacks and whites to work together, to understand each other, will not be found ready-made. It must be created by the fact of contact. He continues, along these lines, I implored everyone in the room to see the morality of making the march completely interracial. Consciences must be enlisted in our movement, I said, not merely racial groups. I reminded them that the dedicated whites who had suffered, bled, and died in the cause of racial justice, and suggested that they reject white participation now would be a shameful repudiation of all that they had sacrificed. He goes on to describe the advent of the slogan Black Power as it arose in that moment, and his critique of it amidst the debate between what appears to have been a split in leadership between younger and older movement leaders, despite his criticism that such a slogan was divisive and potentially derailed the movement's primary goal to emphasize the plight of those who continue to be subjugated by a lack of civil rights and the presence of white supremacy and racism. And yet, King demonstrates a sensitivity to the reality that fostered these sentiments. He remembers many of the young people proclaiming black power today were but yesterday the devotees of black-white cooperation and nonviolent action. With great sacrifice and dedication, he notes, and the radiant faith in the future, they labored courageously in the rural areas of the South. With idealism, they accepted blows without retaliating. With dignity, they allowed themselves to be plunged into filthy, stinking jail cells. With majestic scorn for risk and danger, they nonviolently confronted the Jim Clarks and the Bull Connors of the South and exposed the disease of racism in the body politic. He notes, if they are America's angry children today, this anger is not congenital. It is a response to the feeling that the real solution is hopelessly distant because of its inconsistencies, resistance, and faint-heartedness of those in power. If Stokely Carmichael now says that nonviolence is irrelevant, it is because he, as a dedicated veteran of many battles, has seen with his own eyes the most brutal white violence against blacks and white civil rights leaders, and he has seen it go unpunished. Sound familiar? He writes there, frustration is further fed by the fact that even when blacks and whites die together in the cause of justice, the death of a white person gets more attention and concern than the death of a black person. Stokely and his colleagues from SNCC were with us in Alabama when Jimmy Lee Jackson, a brave young black man, was killed, and when James Reeb, a committed Unitarian white minister, was fatally clubbed to the ground. a committed Unitarian. They remembered how President Johnson sent flowers to the gallant Mrs. Reeb, and in his eloquent "We Shall Overcome" speech paused to mention that one person, James Reeb, had already died in the struggle. Somehow, the president forgot to mention Jimmy, who died first. The parents and the sister of Jimmy received no flowers from the president. The students felt this keenly, not that they felt that the death of James Reeb was less than tragic, but because they felt that the failure to mention Jimmy Jackson only reinforced the impression that to white America, the life of a Negro is insignificant and meaningless. It might be worth remembering this morning that prior to the death of Nicole Renee Good, Salvario Villegas Gonzalez, a father originally from Mexico, was shot while fleeing officers during an ICE operation in September of 2025 in a suburb of Chicago. And 2 other unnamed people were shot and killed in Texas and California later that same year. The fact that they continue to remain unnamed bothers me. All of this is my way of saying that the chaos we currently are experiencing is not new. And it's going to get worse before it gets better. It is part of the birth pangs of a movement trying to find its common ground amidst the disparate but related experiences of so many people. King reminds us that listening to each other deeply, beyond words, to the experiences that have informed our character and our motivation is essential to moving forward. And in all of this, not to lose sight of the fundamental goal of beloved community, which includes all people, nay, I say all beings, in the vision of a just and peaceful world. Beloved, we stand where King once stood, at the trembling edge of a nation, caught between what it fears and what it could become. King saw people rising from the bruised soil of history, carrying victories carved into law, yet still hemmed in by hunger, still shadowed by poverty, still wounded by the quiet machinery of racism and neglect. He named the truth with unflinching clarity, that rights on paper are not bread on the table, that freedom proclaimed is not justice embodied, that progress without transformation is a mirage shimmering over desert sand. He warned that the old ghosts, white complacency, black despair, the seductive lie of violence, the cold logic of militarism would return if left unchallenged. He insisted that the next moment must be deeper than marches, bolder than speeches, more daring than the victories already won. He called us toward a new frontier. Economic justice, shared power, a guaranteed floor beneath every life, a world house where all can dwell, a beloved community woven from courage and compassion. He told us that nonviolence is not the absence of force, but the presence of a greater one. A disciplined moral power capable of bending the long arc with human hands. He told us that chaos is not inevitable, that community is not naive, that the future is not a tide, but a choice. And now, in our own hour of trembling, his question becomes ours. Where do we go from here? Not back to the comfort of illusions, not sideways into the paralysis of cynicism, not downward into the spiral of fear, but forward into the hard, holy work of building what we have not yet seen. Forward into a justice that feeds the hungry and frees the captive and heals the land. Forward into a love that refuses to be sentimental, a power that refuses to be cruel, a hope that refuses to be quiet. Forward, with eyes open, with hearts awake, with hands ready. For the choice remains before us still, chaos or community. And the call rises like a dawn wind over the world. Wake up. Stand up. Build, beloved community, with all of the fierce tenderness your life can hold. Amen. And blessed be.
Thanks for tuning in. If you're just crossing our path, either new to this congregation or curious about Unitarian Universalism, check out our website, uucworcester.org. You'll find lots of information there about our beliefs, the 8 guiding principles, religious exploration for children and adults, our social action initiatives, and the many groups we offer to help people connect and have fun. And consider joining us in person or online on a Sunday morning at 10 a.m. We'd love to meet you.